All right, everyone. So today I wanted to talk about some really good epic champions in Raid Shadow Legends that if you do get them, you are probably going to want to 6-star them and get them to level 60 because they are going to be game changers. Now, this is going to be more champions that I couldn't fit into the last video from a few days ago titled Must Build Epics to Level 60 in Raid Shadow Legends. So if you're interested in even more epics and you haven't seen that video, I'll leave a link in the description and in the comments section. Definitely take a look at that one because in combination, this list of epic champions are going to be some of the best epics in the game. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and start off with a few really strong buffers and debuffers that I was not able to get to in the last video. And having an incredibly strong buffer and debuffer, actually you're going to probably eventually want both, is going to be huge for your team, especially as you end up getting to the mid and the late game. And let's start off with what is going to be one of the most commonly known, very strong debuffer type champions in the game, and that is going to be a champion in the High Elves category, and it's going to be none other than Terrell. Now, Terrell has been for a very long time known as one of the best debuffing based champions in the game, and he is incredibly strong. One of the things that makes him incredibly strong is not just his combination of two very strong debuffs, but it's also the fact that he is a defensive-based champion. And as I've talked about in some of my videos in the past, including a few videos very recently, as you get to the mid and late game, you are definitely going to want to focus on switching the core of your team from more offense-based champions to defense-based champions, because in Raid Shadow Legends, a good defense is going to be a good offense. Not only do defensive-based champions gain defense by building up that stat, but because they scale their damage off of defense, they're also going to gain offense from it as well. So that being one of his strong aspects is going to make him even better in addition to having his very strong debuff. So if you take a look at his skills, his auto attack attacks one enemy 2 times. Each hit has a 40% chance of placing a 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns. Damage inflicted is proportional to defense. So there's that decrease attack debuff. Then we have his second skill, attacks all enemies, has a 75% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. If the target is under a decreased attack debuff, it will place a sleep debuff for 1 turn. Damage inflicted is proportional to defense, and as you can see with skill books, you can also end up increasing that buff debuff chance, similar to the auto attack skill as well. And his third skill, attacks one enemy, decreases the target's turn meter by 50%. If the attack fully depletes the turn meter, it will place a stun debuff for 2 turns. Damage inflicted is proportional to defense. So in addition to his debuffs, he also has a very strong, interesting third skill right here. You can lower the cooldown on this from 5 turns down to 4 turns. Of course, the skill is also damage based on defense. And finally, to top it all off, Terrell also has an increases ally defense in all battles or by 25%, which is definitely not too bad. So overall, an incredibly strong defensive-based debuffing champion. Very, very good skill kit. For a long time, Terrell has kind of been regarded as one of the stronger epic-based defensive debuffing champions in the game, and absolutely going to be a game changer if you don't have a champion with strong debuffs on your team. So that is going to end up being number 1 on the list right there. Now, moving on to number 2, we are still going to be talking about buffers and debuffers. We're going to be moving from the High Elves to the Dwarves category, and we're going to be talking about Rearguard Sergeant. Now, very similar, Rearguard Sergeant is going to have a very strong defensive debuff kit right here. So first skill, attacks one enemy, has a 40% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. Having this on the auto attack is absolutely huge. Not only that, but of course, very similar to Terrell, skill is going to be based off of defensive, and once again, in Raid Shadow Legends, a good defense is going to be a good offense. So having a whole bunch of extra survivability, as well as the strong debuffs on a defensive skill kit is absolutely huge. Second skill, attacks all enemies, so you've got the AoE right there, has a 50% chance, which can be buffed with skill books, has a 50% chance of placing a 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns, heals this champion by 25% of the damage inflicted. So very, very strong. You'll also have an AoE skill. You've got that decreased attack debuff in combination with that decreased defense debuff on the auto attack. So very strong first couple of skills. And the third skill here places a 50% ally protection buff and a 15% continuous heal buff on all allies except this champion for 2 turns. Another very strong skill right there. You've got some additional support and utility. 5-turn cooldown, but of course that can be lowered down to a 3-turn cooldown with skill books. And to top it all off, increases force ally HP in all battles by 33%. So you do have that strong version of the HP aura in all battles, but it is specifically going to be for force champions. So very similar to Terrell, you have a very strong debuffing defensive champion skill kit right here. Rearguard Sergeant is absolutely going to be a game-changing epic champion if you don't have one very similar with these kinds of buffs and debuffs on your team already. So that's going to be number 2 on the list. Now moving on to number 3, we're going to move into another champion, very similar, a little bit different, but similar in that theme of buffs and debuffs, and we're going to be moving to the Lizardmen. We're going to be talking about Jareg. Now Jareg is another champion similar to Terrell and Rearguard Sergeant, except Jareg has a debuff here, and he's also going to have a buff. So instead of having 2 debuffs or 2 buffs, he's going to have a combination of 1 buff and 1 debuff. Now, that's still going to be good, and ideally, as you do end up getting to the mid and the late game, you're probably going to want to incorporate as many buffs and debuffs onto your team as you possibly can. So him still having 2 of those things, I would say probably the 4 most important ones are going to be increased attack, decreased attack, increased defense, decreased defense. So he still has 2 of those 4 very important buffs and debuffs. Just going to be a combination of 1 buff and 1 debuff instead. Now, Jareg is an HP-based champion, but interestingly enough, even though his actual champion menu says HP-based, very importantly, make sure to actually take a look at the skill itself, because it still says damage based on attack. And this is what you are going to want to end up going off of right here. So even though his champion menu says HP, if you actually take a look at his auto attack right here, damage based on attack, so that's actually what is going to scale off of right there. So his first skill right here, attacks one enemy, has a 35% chance, which you can increase with skill books, a decent amount right there, has a 35% chance of placing a 50% decreased attack debuff for 2 turns. Second skill places a 50% ally protection and a 60% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns, which you can lower down to a 4-turn cooldown. And his third skill right here, which is a passive, a very good support utility passive, places a 15% continuous heal buff on an ally for 1 turn whenever an ally loses 20% of their max HP in 1 hit right there. So not only does he have that strong debuff and that strong buff right here with that ally protection, but he also has this very strong support utility passive. And finally, to top it all off, he has that strong version of increases ally HP in all battles by 33%. So another very big HP aura. So Jareg is going to end up being the 3rd champion on that list with that strong combination of buffs and debuffs. So now as we move on to champion number 4 on this list, we're going to move away from that theme of buffs and debuffs to a little bit of a different theme, and we're going to talk about a champion in the Ogryn tribes, and that is going to be a Colt Brawler. So a Colt Brawler is going to be this guy right here, one of the few epics that I still actually don't have yet. And a Colt Brawler has a bit of a different theme. So first skill is going to be a very strong poison. Attacks one enemy, has a 50% chance of placing a 5% poison debuff for 2 turns. You can end up increasing this with skill books. Now again, very important, very similar to Jareg. Even though it says a Colt Brawler is an HP-based champion in his champion description, if you take a look at his skill, you'll see that this skill right here still says that it is based off of attack. So that is what that skill is going to scale off of. His second skill is a Mouthful Curse Eater. Attacks one enemy if this champion is under 1 or more debuffs. This attacker ignores 30% of the enemy defense. If this champion is under 2 or more debuffs, enemy killed by this skill cannot be revived. If this champion is under 3 or more debuffs, the attack is always critical. If the champion is under 4 or more debuffs, this champion heals by 30% of the damage inflicted. If this champion is under 5 or more debuffs, grants an extra turn, removes all debuffs from this champion after the attack. So 4-turn cooldown can be lowered down to a 3-turn cooldown. That is a lot going on that skill, and it might be a bit confusing on why this skill is so crazy until you actually take a look at his third skill, which is going to be his passive, and this is going to be huge. Probably going to be the thing that makes a Colt Brawler as strong of a champion as he actually is, and that is his incredibly valuable passive right here. Places a 2.5% poison debuff on this champion for 4 turns at the start of each turn. So that's going to be that debuff component for his second skill right here. And the second part of the passive has a 70% chance of placing a 5% poison debuff on a random enemy for 4 turns at the start of each turn. So even though it's a random enemy in a battle like the clan boss, because you're only actually facing one enemy, it's always going to end up, you know, being the clan boss. So that's just something to be mindful of when it comes to this passive. But very, very strong right there. 1 turn cooldown. Incredibly awesome passive for poison. That in combination with his auto attack, which also has a chance to add a poison right there. And his very interesting, crazy second skill, which has to do with all those debuffs, but because his passive actually ends up applying debuffs to himself, that's going to help out with the second skill. You have a very interesting skill kit here that, strangely enough, does synergize and provide lots of very good skills when it comes to poison, and a great champion for the clan boss. So a Colt Brawler is kind of one of those champions that you have to dig into a little bit and look and tear apart his skills, no pun intended of course, because when you realize how well his second skill and his passive synergize with that crazy poison that he has on his auto attack and also on his passive, he ends up being one of the strongest debuffer type epics in the game. So absolutely going to be a game changer if you don't have a strong debuffer like him. Now we're going to move on to another champion, and this is going to be a champion in the Undead Horde. And I wanted to talk about Seeker, and the reason why I wanted to talk about Seeker is he might not necessarily be in a lot of people's, you know, top 5, top 10 epic champion list. He might be for some people, but he does have a game-changing skill. And there are probably going to be some other champions, even if they're not epics, you might have some rares. I know Apothecary has a skill similar to this. It's a bit different, but I wanted to talk about his second skill and how this is going to be a massive game changer for various components of the game, especially for Arena. And that's going to be having an incredibly strong turn meter fill type ability right here. So before I jump ahead of myself, let's get into his first skill. He is a defensive based champion. His first skill attacks one enemy 2 times, has a 25% chance of placing a provoke debuff for 1 turn, and of course you can boost this up quite a bit with skill books. His second skill, Tailwind, fills the turn meter of all allies by 30%, places a 50% increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns, grants an extra turn. So at first glance, the skill doesn't seem amazing, but when you lower the cooldown with skill books down to 3 turns, and then you have that grants an extra turn, it's essentially like a 2-turn cooldown with this skill, fills the turn meter of all allies, and that 50% increased attack buff for 2 turns with what is essentially a 2-turn cooldown. Very, very strong, game-changing skill. And Seeker is also going to be an example of one of those champions where the difference between having him skill booked versus not skill booked is huge. Having those 2 extra turns of cooldown on this ability is a game changer. And his third skill right here, which is a passive, definitely overlooked by a lot of people, a very strong passive, heals this champion by 20% HP and places a 60% increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns when hit with a critical hit. So you do have that increased attack on his Tailwind, which is going to be a buff, and you also have this increased defense buff, but it's going to be on his passive. It might not necessarily always activate, but if you do get it to activate, you have a very strong champion with this turn meter fill, and also a buff and another buff. So you have the 2 strong versions of increased attack and defense. He also has increased his ally defense in the arena by 30% for his aura, just as a little added boost. So great champion for the arena. Absolutely fantastic second skill right here with the insane utility that it offers. And that is going to be the 5th champion on the list. Now the 6th champion that I wanted to talk about is going to be in the Orcs category. And again, a champion that's probably not going to be on a lot of people's top 5 or top 10 list, but he has one particular skill that is going to be a game changer. And that's kind of the theme of the video today, is even though some of these champions might not be top 5 or whatnot, they have a particular skill that is going to drastically change your gameplay experience in Raid Shadow Legends, and that is going to be Vrask. Now, Vrask is an HP-based champion, and again, very similar to Seeker. At first glance, you might take a look at him and be like, he doesn't really seem that great, but he has a particular passive that's going to make him absolutely insane, and is going to provide a ton of healing and support for your team. Attacks one enemy, fills the champion turn meter by 20% if the attack is critical. Not really too phenomenal of a skill. Lightning Strike attacks one enemy, damage based on HP, can lower it down to a 3-turn cooldown. Not really going to be too fantastic of a skill, but it's his cannibalism passive right here. Heals all allies by 10% of his max HP when he inflicts a critical hit. Now, if you build Vrask properly with a ton of HP, he's going to be incredibly beefy. He's going to have a ton of life, and you can also build him up to have 100% critical rate, so you don't have to worry about this passive not activating. So every time he attacks, he's going to activate his passive, and he's going to end up healing your entire team for a pretty large amount. So build this guy up with lots of HP, lots of defenses. You don't need to worry about his damage so much. That's not really going to be his main focus, and he's going to be extremely beefy and heal your team for a ton. Great support champion right here. And another champion that you want to be mindful of, maybe not going to be worth using skill books. He's not really going to benefit a lot. In fact, some people prefer not to skill book up his Lightning Strike right here and rather have it be unbooked. So I know I talked about this a long time ago, but there are certain champions in Raid Shadow Legends where you might actually want to avoid skill booking them, and Vrask is going to be an example of one of those champions. He also has this strong increases ally defense in dungeons by 33% aura, just to top off his incredible support and utility. And the last champion that I wanted to talk about on this list is going to be in the Knights Revenant, and this is going to arguably be one of the best epics in the game. I wanted to save one of the best for last. Probably should have been number 1 on the list in my last video, but I wanted to mix it up and make it the last champion in this video, and that is going to be one of the newer additions. Came out at the same time as Madame Cerise, and that is going to be Miscreated Monster. Now, this guy is a total beast of a champion. I could talk about this guy in particular for 10 to 15 minutes. That is how insane he is. Maybe I will in the future. I'm definitely working on trying to build this guy up myself. I have a lot of champions that I'm working on, but this guy is towards the top of the list. So he is an HP based epic champion, and he's got a crazy skill kit right here. Attacks one enemy 2 times. Each hit has a 15% chance of placing a stun debuff for 1 turn, has a 50% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense debuff for 1 turn if the stun debuff is placed. Attacks all enemies, has a 50% chance of placing a stun debuff for 1 turn, places a shield buff on all allies for 3 turns equal to 25% of the damage inflicted. And you have this chance to stun right here that synergizes with this auto attack. You also have that decreased defense debuff if that stun is placed, so you also have that additional debuff right there. Damage based on HP, of course. You can increase the buff debuff chance with skill books. You can lower the cooldown on the second skill from 4 turns down to 3 turns. The shield component to the second skill is absolutely huge, and if you build up this champion properly, that shield component is going to be a game changer nonetheless, without a doubt. Just that part of the skill right there, without getting into all his other craziness. Then you have his third skill, places a 50% ally protection buff on all allies except this champion for 3 turns. Heals this champion by 50% of their max HP. That is a huge heal considering he is an HP based champion and you are going to be building him up with a ton of HP. He also scales off of HP, so that's not only going to increase his survivability, it's going to increase his damage, and it's also going to increase the effectiveness of his shield buff and the effectiveness of this heal right here. Places a 50% continuous heal buff on this champion for 3 turns. You can lower this down from a 6-turn cooldown down to a 4-turn cooldown. He also has this passive right here, places a fear debuff on the attacker for 1 turn whenever an ally is attacked while under an ally protection buff. And finally, you have his aura, increases ally HP in the arena by 33%. So this guy is a complete monster, no pun intended. Absolutely crazy champion, one of the best new epics introduced into the game. If you're newer to the game, might be a little bit too much to kind of take in with all of his skills, but they all synergize very well together, and the fact that he is an incredibly strong HP based champion with a super strong shield buff and a very beefy healer right here with a debuff and just a lot of stuff that works really well together. Again, if built up properly, this guy can absolutely destroy pretty much all the content in Raid Shadow Legends. So that's going to be a list of, I believe that was 7 game-changing epic champions in the game. Again, I talked about, I think, another 6 more in the video from a few days ago, and there might even be more that I still haven't talked about, but that's going to be everything that I can end up covering in this video right here. We're already at about 20 minutes, so I am indeed going to end up leaving it here. If you guys enjoyed this video and you want more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to the channel. Really appreciate all the support, everyone. So thank you once again. 25,000 subscribers. If you want to help out, tossing a quick like means more than you can even imagine. So thank you to all of you guys who do that. And of course, more Raid Shadow Legends videos should be popping up on the screen right about now. Feel free to check them out. Again, I'll link that video where I talk about more game-changing must-build epics in the comments. I'll link it in the description if you guys want to take a look at that. And there might even be more epics that I'm missing out on. So feel free to comment below which of these epics you have, which of them you built, which of them you're working on building, and which epics I still haven't talked about that you consider to be game changers in Raid Shadow Legends. Have a great day, everyone. Take care, and until next time, this is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.